So let's get started. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm really glad to have you here on the first webinar on regulatory science. My name is Lada Leyens. I am the coordinator of the Center of Regulatory Science at Personalised School of Public Health. And I'm very honored to be your host today and your speaker today for this first webinar, and also to introduce to you the work of the Center of Regulatory Science and what the webinar series would look like in the future. So thank you very much for joining us. Before we go ahead, just some housekeeping. The session will be recorded. During the presentation, your microphones are disabled, but please do use the chat for questions. I really encourage you to put questions inside because we will have time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. During the Q&A, your microphones will be enabled again. Please raise your hand before speaking so we can go in a good order. And if you have unanswered questions after the whole session, please send them to this email that you see here, and we'll try to answer them as soon as possible. And after the session, we will be very grateful if you fill the questionnaire that will be circulated to all of the participants in order to approve this webinar series to fit your needs. Before going on with the presentation, I wanted to introduce to you the Center for Regulatory Science, which is a research center at Personalised School of Public Health at Manipal Academy of Higher Education. And the center was created because we really see changing in the landscape in drug development. And you will hear some of these changes in the presentation today. And we really see how this change just require a change also in the regulatory practices and regulatory framework that we have constructed over the years, so that we can truly deliver on that promise of bringing efficacious and safe drugs to patients earlier. So at the Center for Regulatory Science, we work towards this vision, and we do that by bringing together experts from different disciplines to advance the field of regulatory science in India and globally. And we do that by in 3 different streams. So we're planning an executive course on drug development and regulatory affairs. And we do that with a very established institute in Basel University, the European Center for Pharmaceutical Medicine, who have run this course very successfully for over 20 years. So we're planning to do a similar course in India, and stay tuned for that one. We also perform research that can advance regulatory science, and our PhD scholar, Viola Sousa, who is on the call today and has been instrumental for this webinar series, is working on this at the center. And then we also organize workshops and courses and webinars like this series to expand the knowledge in the community. And why a webinar series on regulatory science? So we are planning this series to exactly do that, to bring what are new aspects of regulatory science and how we can advance this field. So we're preparing different types of topics related to regulatory science, to drug development, that will bring to you over the next months and years. And the first one that we have planned is today for regulatory aspects of personalized healthcare from the global perspective. And we're planning to cover global topics and also local topics from India, and have speakers from academia, industry, and local and global. So I hope that you enjoy this series. The next talk that will be in the July-August timeframe would be on regulatory policies and strategies for international markets, which is going to be delivered by Dr. Bhushan Sarod, who is Regulatory Policy Lead International at Roche. So look, stay tuned as well for the more information on the exact date for this webinar. And with no further ado, let's get into the topic that we have brought today to you. So I'm going to be covering regulatory aspects of personalized healthcare from the global perspective. As I said, I'm the coordinator for the Center of Regulatory Science at Personalised School of Public Health. I also work as a Global Regulatory Director at Roche. And my past experiences comes from regulatory authorities. I was working as a clinical trial reviewer and inspector at Swissmedic, also working at the EMA, and before that also in medical devices. And today, to cover the topic of regulatory aspects of personalized healthcare, I will cover it in 3 different perspectives. So first, we'll see some basic principles of personalized healthcare, then some basic principles of regulatory approvals, and after that, I will deep dive into some new technologies and the impact that it's having on the regulatory landscape, as well as some new regulatory pathways that we're seeing. And this from the perspective of genomic profiling, clinical decision and support, and software as a medical device, digital endpoints, and real-world evidence. But let's look at some basic principles of personalized healthcare. We really see now the convergence of science and technology and how it's providing an exceptional opportunity to transform healthcare. We see it from the data, technology, analytics, and drug development perspective. And you may be thinking, but we have always had data and analyzed it and used technology. But we really see now a major turn that really offers this exceptional opportunity with much more data that is being collected through digital means. It can be analyzed, many more powerful analytic tools that can really help to gather insights from this data, and then new technologies that offer to collect data in ways that were never thought before. So we really see how this three together, the data, technology, and the analytics, are providing opportunities to address healthcare challenges and accelerate R&D and improve patient outcomes, which is our end goal. So this is happening from, you can see this in clinical care for patients and also from the drug development perspective. So you see here on the right-hand side, clinical care, and on the left-hand side, R&D, and I will go into more depth on these topics in the next slides. But we can really see how technologies and advanced analytics are helping to improve patient outcomes through earlier diagnosis, better care plan, full access to optimal care, and also afterwards continuous remote monitoring. And then we also see from the R&D perspective how new data and technologies are helping to do more faster, more efficient R&D. So if we look at the patient journey through healthcare, new data technology and new discoveries in science are allowing us to do early and more accurate diagnosis, which then helps to better define patient populations and give a more accurate treatment. Then you have the more tailored care plan, which leads to novel and targeted personalized treatments. Also prediction of how these treatments are going to be efficacious on the patient, and more effective and efficient decision-making from the healthcare professional side. We also see faster and better decisions on the safety, efficacy, and value for each individual patient, and access to integrated and personalized treatment options. And last but not least, we can also offer more remote monitoring and care, and we see that happening with a lot of technology companies, and so also partnering with patient associations and with drug developers to really offer this more personalized remote monitoring and care at the home of the patient, which hopefully improves quality of life of patients. If we look at it from the R&D perspective, we're also seeing very interesting uses of technology and novel approaches. So if you see from the right-hand side, we have new study designs that use technologies and new approaches to allow for faster identification of efficacious drugs. Then we see the whole aspects of omics that provide biomarkers that enable more rapid detection of treatment efficacy. And this is also thanks to the advances in science and biology understanding. Then we see artificial intelligence, algorithms, and very complex data analytics that can automate clinical imaging analysis and also generate more sensitive endpoints. On the real world data side, we're also seeing very interestingly, and I will talk about it more, how it's really helping to complement the data that we have from our clinical trials and create that totality of evidence package. And it can help us in that way to run smaller, more efficient clinical studies. And then if we see how digital tools are being used in clinical trials, right now there is a big potential, and it's already happening, and I'll talk about it more later, on how we can capture the lived experience of patients in trials to really measure outcomes that matter to patients. So now that we have seen some basics in personalized healthcare, let's look at principles of regulatory approvals. So what does a successful medicine look like? Let's look at it. So a successful medicine has a positive benefit-risk ratio and hopefully changes the treatment paradigm. It has a clear therapeutic benefit for patients. It has side effects that are understood and manageable. It improves them or maintains quality of life, and also how patients feel, function, and survive. It is convenient to use, and it is cost-effective. That's what a successful medicine looks like. And what are regulators interested in when they're doing their review of these medicines? So for marketing authorization, before allowing the drug to go onto the market, authorities look at the benefit risk of the drug. And in order to look for a positive benefit risk, they focus on the safety of the drug, the efficacy of the drug, and the quality of the drug, of its manufacturing. And if there is this positive benefit risk, so more benefits than there are risks for the patient, the drug is approved and receives marketing authorization. There is an increase in emphasis on relative benefit risk comparing to other molecules on the market, which is really important. And even though cost effectiveness is not part of the process of regulatory approval, it is becoming increasingly important, and regulators are realizing that they need to close the gap between payers, health technology assessment, and regulatory agencies. And there are different pilots that are showing that they're doing that at the moment. There's also a paradigm shift in drug development. So how we're used to drug development over the past many years has been, we look at it in preclinical research. Once we identify that it's safe to move into first in human, we go first in human and we follow the typical phases of phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical studies. And then once you have phase 3 data, you would submit it for regulatory approval. And then you conduct on-market trials to keep on evaluating safety and efficacy, and also to look at other indications. Well, we're really seeing a shift to that. And that's a very interesting aspect of the past 10 or 20 years. We see some of the preclinical work where we don't have animal models for human diseases. We see it fully based on in vitro packages going into first in human. We also see seamless trial designs that cover phase 1, 2, and 3 in one, or maybe phase 2 and 3 in one. We also see phase 2 confirmatory data that is used for conditional approvals to put the drug first on the market if we see a striking benefit risk. And then, of course, with later studies, you would confirm that conditional approval into a full approval, also leveraging real-world evidence. And we also see how phase 4 clinical studies and real-world evidence is looping back into the earlier phases to inform either new indications or new treatment modalities. And this is really possible because there is this earlier continual dialogue that is being really pushed by regulators with sponsors. As I said, we're really moving away from this phase 1, 2, 3, and we have seen that during the COVID pandemic with some of the major vaccines or treatments being developed in this way. And this really helped us to be in a more iterative development, which reaches patients faster. We also see more flexible health authority processes, which I will go into detail in the next slides. Reduce filing review times. Each regulatory agency, not only the major ones, are looking at how to reduce their review times and also how to accept earlier evidence for these conditional approvals. I was talking before about this more flexible regulatory approvals. So here is an example of expedited review pathways that facilitate this faster access to promising medicines. And all of these ones that you see on the slide are focused on faster review. So after you have conducted all of your drug development, clinical trials, the review of the promising drugs that are selected by regulators happens faster. And we see some of this, so I've covered here mainly the US, EU, and Switzerland, but you see here some examples with priority review, fast track, accelerated assessment in the EU, the PRIME scheme, and the fast track procedure in Switzerland with really faster approvals. Some of these procedures also enable more iterative discussions with the agencies throughout the development, which is something that agencies really ask for. So come early to talk to the agency so that you can discuss the way the drug is being developed and ensure that it's in a way that would be acceptable for approval. And we also see very interesting initiatives with parallel reviews where agencies are working together. So if we look at the Access Consortia, that's Canada, Switzerland, Singapore, and Australia, and the UK now working very closely together and sharing parts of the dossier to do in parallel review to lead to approval. And we have seen some very interesting examples where it has actually led to faster approval in these countries. There's also a very interesting initiative in South Africa with Sasibona that has also led to very interesting and fast regulatory procedures for these countries. And then we have the Orbis pilot of the FDA, where they're looking at oncology drugs and sharing the review between also different authorities, including Health Canada, Swissmedic, and TGA in Singapore. So very interesting as well from the regulatory's perspective, where they're innovating in their procedures. And if we look at other types of innovation, which is rather than being faster when you have the full dossier, looking at how you can evaluate earlier evidence to give that conditional approval. You see here some examples. So in the EU side, we see conditional approval under exceptional circumstances. In Switzerland, also the new conditional approval that was lately included in the legislation, and in the US also with accelerated approval and other pathways. So, and here is also again where health authorities and sponsors really engage much earlier in the development to see how they can bring these drugs faster to patients. And also what types of evidence are needed after the conditional approval to reach that full approval. So maybe conditional approval is really focused on a smaller population, and then the fuller approval is on a bigger population where the drug can be used because there is that evidence from the later studies. So now that we have seen basics of personalized healthcare and also basics of how regulators are looking at drugs, what they're interested in, and some of their new pathways that they're putting in place, let's look in more detail at these new technologies that I was talking about and new approaches and new science and how it's impacting the regulatory landscape and how regulators are implemented it in their processes. So, and you may be thinking, okay, what new technologies and treatment modalities are you actually talking about? So here you see some of them. On the right-hand side, we see this digital wearables and app that I was talking before, and they're being used in R&D to monitor patients during the trial, but to also collect some outcome measures that are more relevant to patients and that can really follow the patient at home. So if we have an example of a trial where a patient would come every 2 months to the clinic to have the medicine in the trial and to get checkups, the doctor would only see the patient in those every 2 months, right? So, but maybe in between these 2 months, there are some interesting aspects of the changes in the disease that are happening to the patient that are very important also to measure. And thanks to new technologies, we can actually do that now and follow up the patient at home and collect these measure outcomes at home. And I will talk about that later in the digital endpoint section. And some of this data collected through digital can actually also be used as real-world data. So if we think about how digital is then used once the drug is on the market with the patient to monitor patients as they go about their daily life, then that can become real-world data that is very insightful to then have better insights and do better drug development that can then benefit the patient. So very interesting perspective as well of how you're using that data from clinical practice to keep informing the development and even investigating new indications. So for that, it's really essential to have the right data infrastructure in a country, and I will talk about that a bit later. We also see with digital clinical decision support software, which has been around for a while, but is being improved, where you can really put all of the information on one patient together to get insights and help the decision making of the treatment of the person much better. So very interesting advances going there. Of course, we have new diagnostic platforms that follow also the new developments in omics and in how we understand disease to really be able to better diagnose our patients and better know what treatment will fit better for them, be more efficacious and have less risks. One of these examples is circulating tumor DNA, where we can look in the blood whether patients have tumor markers, which is less invasive than the typical ways of looking at it and very promising. And on the part of new treatment modalities, we're seeing cell and gene therapy that are being used more and more. And you see that now one aspect of it could be considered with the mRNA vaccines of how these new treatment modalities and new way of drug development and new technologies in drugs can really help us to do more targeted treatments and have better patient outcomes because you're really targeting for that individual patient how they're going to improve in their disease. Another very interesting development is with histology-independent drug development, where we're looking beyond, especially if you look at tumors, we're looking beyond where the tumor is to see what the markers are and what personalized treatments for those specific markers can help the patient. So very interesting developments there. With studies also looking at it from that histology-independent perspective, looking at the biomarkers instead of the location. And regulators now, if we go back to regulatory science, regulators are also seeing this innovation and are also looking at how they can support that from their perspective and get up to speed. And they're learning at the same pace as everybody else, so how they can implement that into the regulatory processes. So we see very interesting new regulatory science that is happening also from the regulator side. And here you see from the FDA side in the PDUFA negotiation circles how this is the PDUFA 6 focus areas, but now they're being in negotiation for PDUFA 7, how new topics are coming out that the FDA is interested in looking into more details. So here you see for complex trial designs, like umbrella and basket and platform trials, the FDA has set up a pilot where they're looking in more detail with sponsors how these designs are being set up, and really through the pilot engaging very closely to understand the design better. You also see the model-informed drug development pilot, where FDA is looking in more detail at how sponsors are looking into clinical pharmacology data modeling to inform further development or even to infer some data from that for the marketing authorization approvals. Then we also see the qualification procedures that are looking at new drug development tools like biomarkers, clinical outcome assessments, or as well new preclinical models to look at how we can use this new technology and new science to better develop our drugs. Real world evidence is another very important topic for the FDA, where they are already using it with their Sentinel program for safety, but they're also looking at how they can leverage this evidence for efficacy analysis. They're also looking into benefit risk assessment, and of course, a very dear to their heart is the patient voice, so patient-focused drug development. How can we make sure that we're developing drugs in a way that is patient-focused and that really incorporates the patient voice? In the EU side, there are also very interesting developments, and we see that from the Commission side with the EU digital health and care developments, which are looking at 3 priorities. So first, citizens secure access to their health data, European data infrastructure for research and personalized healthcare, and citizen empowerment via digital tools. So that's how the Commission is looking on the digital health and care. And then from the regulators' perspective, we're also seeing from the European medicines agencies and the head of the national agencies, the Regulatory Science to 2025 roadmap, where they have 5 goals for human medicines regulation to look at new technologies and how to and new data sources and other innovations to how they're implemented that in their regulatory framework. So here you see the catalyzing the integration of science and technology in medicines development and how to support that, driving collaborative evidence generation, advancing patient-centered access to medicines. So again, here you see the patient centricity coming, addressing emerging health threats, which has shown now with the pandemic how important that is, that regulators work closely to really make sure that the regulatory processes are fit for purpose, or enabling and leveraging research and innovation in regulatory science. So how can they do regulatory science research to inform future pathways and frameworks? And even if we go at a higher level, at the global perspective with the ICH guidances, where all major regulatory agencies are contributing to write the guidances together with industry and other associations, and also are then implemented the guidances in the regions. And there are 4 major types of guidances. We have the efficacy guidances, the multidisciplinary, the safety, and the quality. And some of these guidances are going either major renovations, and I will talk about that a little bit later, or they're even creating new guidances to cover some of the innovative topics that we're seeing. So let's look at the multidisciplinary and the efficacy guidances. On the multidisciplinary one, we have the structure harmonized protocol that is looking at creating a structured protocol so that it's easier also for sites to implement the trials, and very interesting work done there. On the efficacy side, they're looking at so we see 2 existing guidances that are being updated with the E6, which is the Good Clinical Practice Guidance, which looks at how we conduct clinical trials and is going through its 3rd renovation. And you will see later what their goals of the renovations are. And also the E8, which is the general guidance for clinical trials, which talks more about the design. It's also undergoing the last stages of renovation with the renovation 1 that goes in the same direction of what I'm going to talk about later. Then we also see E19 being updated for safety data collection, and E20 offering a very interesting guidance on adaptive clinical trials that is being worked on right now. I haven't included here the E9, but that's also a very interesting one that introduces the estimate framework for statistical analysis. That is also a very important one. Why has ICH thought that the major GCP renovation was needed, good clinical practice renovation for ICH E8 and E6? That was really to update to accommodate for new technology. So they really want to be responsive to the rapidly evolving ecosystem, what I've been covering over the past 20 minutes, how we're advancing evidence generation with new trial designs, how we're increasingly living in a digital world and also in drug development, adapting more digital technologies. And also, as I said, how we're innovating in clinical trial designs. So for example, with decentralized trials where we're bringing the trial to the patient instead of having the patient go to the clinical sites. And they are really trying now, in the way that they have published their draft principles, they're trying to think about this rapidly evolving ecosystem and how to create a guidance that is risk-based, that introduces the risk-based approach and proportionality. What is your trial data going to answer as a regulatory question? And in that way, you have to decide what data quality you need. But it also wants to leverage and facilitate the increasingly digital ecosystem, as I said, and not be outdated in 2 or 3 years, right? They want to really stay as a guidance that really can evolve with that rapidly evolving ecosystem without needing yearly updates. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this guidance continues to develop and renovate in the next 1 to 2 years. And I've been talking about how regulators adapt to the environment to evaluate drugs, but it's also very interesting to see how regulators are exploring how to use innovative technologies to future-proof their agencies and facilitate regulatory decision-making. So here you have 3 examples that are very interesting to look into. So if we look from the left-hand side on cloud-based submissions, there is a very interesting project ongoing right now, which I encourage you to look into, which is called Accumulus Synergy, that is looking to establish a cloud-based platform with regulators to do cloud-based submissions. And this would be in the future vision, really to cover the whole drug development pathway. When data is available, you share it with regulators on the cloud, and then regulators can look at it in live. And that way, the vision is that this would result in faster approvals once the data is mature and faster access to drugs. Then on another perspective, real-world evidence is a very interesting one. I said before that the FDA is looking at it in very much detail, and they already used their Sentinel program to use it for safety aspects, so for informing safety decisions. And they're also looking at it from the efficacy perspective, which is a little bit more challenging, but they're really looking at how they can make it work. And also other agencies like the European Agency are very involved in this aspect and have been involved in IMI projects at the European level to see how to advance this field together with sponsors and technology companies, and also in the regulatory science roadmap to 2025 that I mentioned before. That's a big part of the discussion. How can we use real-world evidence, real-world data to inform regulatory decision-making? And then if we look at the data analytics and AI side, there are also very interesting pilots and proof of concept happening at the agencies to use machine learning algorithms and natural language processing to make their regulatory processes more efficient and faster. This doesn't mean that the reviewers don't get to take the decision. This still only informs reviews that then, based on their scientific and medical knowledge, would still take the decisions, but it can really help in increasing efficiencies in the system. And there are pilots in most of the agencies, big agencies. Now let's look at how genomic profiling is being used. And some of you may be very familiar with this, but as I said before, new development in omics have really brought more advances in personalized healthcare in the past years. So if we look at the tumor and patient profiling from the immunotherapy perspective, we can either do genomic profiling to characterize the tumor and then determine the probability of efficacy response with a drug that is targeted to that specific tumor genomic profile of the patient. Or we also can look at the germline polygenic profiling to help establish the safety and toxicity profile on the patient. So 2 very interesting ways of approaching genomic profiling for patients to select the right molecule that is going to have the highest efficacy and the lowest toxicity. And regulators are really showing interest in this perspective. They really understand the importance of integrating these new developments in science, genomics, and in biology to inform as well how we treat patients and how we're developing our drugs. So here you see some examples of FDA guidances and where they are addressing NGS-based companion diagnostics and testing to really complete robust analytical and clinical validation studies for these NGS so that we can make sure that really that we can trust them to inform the treatment of the patients. There are precedents as well of companion diagnostics approvals outside of the US, and we see that in different regions. There are no major regulatory frameworks established yet. In Europe, we now have with the IVD legislation coming in next year, some more regulatory frameworks for it. And as well, we see how other omics approaches may also become increasingly common in the future. So we have transcriptomic, proteomics, and you name it. There is a whole array of possibilities in how this can inform in the future patient treatment and also drug development. And more building onto that, we really see how personalized medicine is a regulatory imperative and how regulatory agencies really have a widespread recognition for how each patient has potentially a different response to drug therapy, and how we're starting to understand that much better, and how regulators really expect now that we address pharmacogenomics in the labeling and also in the development of our drugs. And here you see guidances from the FDA and the EMA. But we also see very interesting publications in the past years where there are recommendations that so if you see here, the last one from ASCO is patients should receive timely and up-to-date education about immunotherapies, their mechanism of action, and the clinical profile of possible immunogenic reaction adverse events prior to initiating therapy. So really being able to look at the patient, see what's their needs, what's their genomic profile, everything else around there, and see how to inform from that perspective their treatment. So going back to some of the digital topics I was talking before, let's look at the clinical decision support and software as a medical device regulations in more detail. The software as a medical device regulations, I'm going to cover it from the US and EU perspective. We see draft guidances in the US defining which software they intend to provide regulatory oversight to. So that's the FDA CDRH part of the FDA. And the CDR part is the one looking at molecules and CBER biologics. They have also created a new digital health center of excellence to be able to work more closely with develop digital health software as a medical device developers in order to make sure that these developments reach the patient when they're being very promising for patients and their treatments. And interestingly, in software as a medical device regulation is very much based on risk, the approach that they are taking, on the classification, also on the regulatory oversight. So they're looking at the risk from different perspectives. From one perspective, on the significance of the information that is provided. Is it going to inform clinical management? Is it going to drive clinical management? Is it going to diagnose the patient, or is it going to treat the patient, like with digital therapeutics? But then it also factors in the state of the healthcare situation. So is it a non-serious situation? Is it a serious or a critical situation? And depending on that, there are different risk categories, and depending on that, there are different regulatory pathways that have to be taken by the developers. And this is based on the IMDRF approach that was developed by global regulators together and then implemented in the regions in own guidances. When we look at the EU side, it's also based on a risk-based approach. So we have the new medical device regulation that has come into place last month, and also the new IVDR, so in vitro diagnostic regulation that will come into place in 2022. And here in digital health, we really see, as I said before, from the FDA perspective, there are different either regulated or unregulated software depending on what it does for the treatment of the patient. And there are, depending on Rule 11, there are also the ones that are medical devices that classify into different risk-based categories. And there are very good decisions trees that can be followed to decide whether one digital health solution is a medical device or not. It's interesting in the EU, it's not like in the US where you have under FDA the Center for Devices and the Center for Drugs. You really have here a complete separate regulatory framework for medical devices that is now coming a little bit closer to the drug regulatory framework for combination products, like is specified in the medical device regulation. So in the EU, we have certified notified bodies that are looking at the evidence for putting on the market the medical devices and certifying these medical devices with the CE mark. And then the CDS, it's a very interesting perspective. It has slight adjustments. So in the FDA part, they have a specific guidance for clinical decision support tools, and in the EU they may fall under the MDR or the IVDR depending on what function they have, these clinical decision supports. Let's look at how digital is being used in clinical trials. So digital endpoints, and I covered a little bit about it before in my past slides, but here it's a little bit going into more detail. So how are we using digital health technologies and how is it impacting clinical research? Or what is the promise really for the future? So if you think about what I was saying before, patients come in every 2 months into the clinic for follow-up where investigators are gathering the data that is going to then be used in the clinical trial to establish efficacy and safety of the drug. Now with these digital tools, it really offers us an opportunity to better measure, more granular measures, and also continuous measures at the real life experience of the patient and not once they're going to the clinic. And really, we have either wearables or apps on phones or other digital tools that offer a wide array of possibilities. So it can help with voice analytics, and that is being used for either diseases like depression or also in other types of diseases where symptoms are including cough. We also see measurements of heart rate, temperature, oximetry, physical activity. So how much do patients move and exercise and how active they are, which is very relevant for many conditions. Blood pressure, respiratory rate, cough, sleep, fine motor skills. So stress, and specifically, for example, for Parkinson's diseases, they're looking at how they can better measure symptoms of Parkinson's diseases. So a lot of different aspects that we can now measure better. And why are we doing this? So as it was mentioned before, the current endpoints have been well established and are being used in clinical research, but we're really measuring before what we could measure instead of what we should measure. So we still have conditions where the endpoints are not ideal and we have unmet measurement needs. And these new digital tools that can capture this measure really can cover these unmet measurement needs with new types of endpoints. We can really have more granular views into the disease instead of every 2 months, maybe every week or every day. We can measure in the real world setting of patients. So not once they go to the clinic, maybe they are outperforming to impress the physician or they're very tired from the trip to the clinic. But here is really on the real world setting. We can even have a potential for more efficient trials if we're having more sensitive and reliable endpoints. And we can facilitate the centralized trials that I was mentioned before and facilitating remote data collection for measurements at home. There are also some challenges that we should take into account. This can really add burden on the top of the patient. So we really have to make sure that we develop these measures together with patients to make sure we capture what is meaningful for them, but also that we capture it in a way that is not increasing burden for them. And one example of how regulators are accepting this endpoint. So we have one qualified digital measure as an endpoint, which is the one that you see here for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And it's being collected with this device that you see here. And why I have these 4 images here in the center is because this has really resulted from a very close collaboration between specialists, so medical doctors, specialists on the condition, technology developers that have developed the device, drug developers, and the patients at the center, really together with patients. And this has led to a very successful qualification procedure from the EMA, where they have accepted to use this measurement in Duchenne muscular dystrophy as a secondary endpoint in these trials. And now they're looking at how to improve it to primary endpoint. And also working with the FDA to get it qualified there. But that's not the only measure that is being used in trials. So DIME, this is a very interesting society if you're interested in more information on digital endpoints. Digital Medicine Society, they have a lot of information on how to develop them, but also what endpoints are now being used in trials. And they have seen that there are more than 60 sponsors collecting digital endpoint data in their trials. It really ranges across all phases of drug development, and they're being used either to develop drugs, devices, and also biologics. And we're using them mainly as exploratory secondary endpoints, but also some as primary endpoints. So it's a very interesting development. The FDA has even accepted this for one development to be used as their primary endpoint in the trial. So we're going in a very interesting direction. One aspect that we have to consider is that even though there are so many digital measures being used in trial, not many of them, and I can't remember the exact figure, I think it was 5% of them, are the same measures being used in a similar indication. So we have to make sure as well in this development that we don't all start measuring different things in trials so that we can still at the end compare the results of the trial. So also one aspect to keep into account. Now let's look at real-world data and evidence. And maybe some of this real-world data is actually being collected by some of these digital tools on the market. So why you can maybe be thinking, we have been using data for so long and analyzing data for so long. What is new right now? So really, we can collect more and different data. We have genomics data, proteomics data, data from digital devices, and also from electronic health records in many regions that we can all put together. And we can link this data to really, with different algorithms and data analytics to extract different insights. And then once we analyze this data, we can really, from complex data sets, get insights that can help us to either better treat a patient or better develop a drug. What we have to do, and we cannot forget, is really what the potential lies in is really combining all of these different data sources into meaningful real-world data sets. And how we're using this, so going back to regulatory, how we're using this for different regulatory purposes is either as historical control arms for trials, single-arm trials. So looking at how does the efficacy of the drug in the trial compare to historical control arms. We're also using it to support conditional approval commitments. So once the drug is on the trial after conditional approval, how is the efficiency and efficacy and safety on the market? Also to support access discussions with payers and health technology assessments, to extend indications if we have proof of positive efficacy in other indications with the drug. Safety signal detection, this remains one of the big current uses of real-world evidence, is really for safety signal detection. And then also a very interesting development is with model virtual patients. So really taking electronic health records, modeling virtual patients out of it and using that to improve trial designs and maybe even in the future to conduct in silico trials for some conditions or at some steps of drug development. And how are regulators accepting this? So I said before, there are a lot of pilots and projects going on from regulatory agencies together with other stakeholders on how they can use it in the future. But actually, they're already being used right now. So if we see at full approval of the drug, of course, we still see sporadic use. Then for safety monitoring, we see is on the other extreme, we see it being used routinely. And for extensions of indications, we see limited use. And here you can see some examples of drug approvals based on real-world data with Amgen's Blincito, so blinatumomab in acute lymphoblastic leukemia, with Pfizer's and Merck's avelumab for metastatic Merkel cell carcinoma, or with Yescarta, the CAR-T cells therapy from Gilead for B-cell lymphoma. So in most of these cases, it's been approving based on singular trials that have used generated historical controls. And as I said before, we're really seeing on both sides in the US and in the EU, regulators being interested in how to even advance that even more for use on regulatory decision making. So before we move to the Q&A, let's summarize what we have seen today. We have seen how regulatory approval procedures are built on evidence-based benefit risk assessments. So remember what I was saying about what a successful medicine looks like and what regulators are interested in to do their benefit risk evaluation. Healthcare has been greatly impacted by increased understanding of disease of biology and innovative technologies. This has led to really increased molecular testing and patient profiling and use of technology to enable personalized healthcare approaches. And regulators are really developing innovative regulatory approaches and are open to explore new areas of future proof. And I would take it even one step farther and say, now we're trying to improve the current paradigm, but do we even need in the future a new paradigm? And in the Center of Regulatory Science, we're going to be conducting research to evaluate what that new paradigm in the future may look like and how we can make it work really for the benefit of patients. So I would like to thank my colleagues from the Roche Regulatory Personalized Healthcare team who have contributed to the slides, and also very dearly to Violet Sousa, who is our PhD scholar at PSPH Center for Regulatory Science, who has been instrumental in organizing and making this webinar series possible. And with that, let me go back to you to see if there are any questions in the chat.
Ma'am, we have two questions.
Yes, so the Platform Technology Agency, I'm gonna write it here. So it's a Cumulus Synergy. And it's a non-for-profit that is looking at establishing this collaboration between sponsors and also regulators. And they're working very closely now with global regulators, so really from all the regions, to make this possible and to start with piloting. Thank you for that question. And then another question, are there guidelines to select digital tools, or can available digital solution in the market be incorporated? That's a great question. So I would say if we're looking at the use in clinical trials, one key thing to see is not look at what technology I can use and then what can I use it for. I think one key aspect to take into account is what is relevant for the indication I'm working in, what is relevant for my patient population in this indication, and then even work with patients through qualitative studies or other types of studies to see what is relevant to them. So for example, in multiple sclerosis, is it relevant to them how much they can walk before they're wheelchair bound, or how much they can use their hands, for example. And then when you have that, what's relevant to patients, you can start looking, okay, what's that aspect of health, meaningful aspect of health that I want to measure, and what specific aspect of that, what concept of interest I want to measure. And then after that, you go and select a digital tool that you can use in the trial that can actually measure that. There may be some already on the market, so there are different tools on the market. Actigraphy has some interesting tools that are being used. And if you go to this Time Society, you will see what tools are the ones that are being used. If there is no tool, then maybe you have to work with a tech developer, or even internally, or with academia, or with different partners to develop the tool that could measure what you want to measure. And then you have to think about the validation. So you have to validate the tool to make sure that it's collecting data in a way that it ensures data integrity, because you need to make sure that that data can be relied on for the regulatory decision making. And you also need to validate the endpoint to make sure that that measure is really measuring what you wanted to measure. So, and there are different ways of developing that. And again, in that Time Society, you see there is very interesting playbooks that inform that. Then if you're looking on the market to use the tools to monitor patients on the market, there are different software as a medical device already available, but if there is nothing for your patient population, again, very important to think at it from the patient perspective and work with patients to design the tools to make sure that they're going to use it, the design is fit in their needs, but also that it's actually useful and relevant and feasible for them. I hope that answers the question, and please feel free to unmute your mics now if you want to follow the discussion on these two questions, or if you want to ask any other questions. While you're thinking about other questions, I'm curious to hear from you as well. How much experience had you had with these topics? Is it completely new to you, or have you already been using it or been in contact with it? And I know I've covered very global aspects, so not focused in India at all, but in the future, so for example, the next talk on regulatory policies is going to cover also aspects of India, and we're also looking at bringing speakers from India that can cover more local topics. So if you want to either unmute and share your experience, or write in the chat, I'm looking forward to hear how much experience you had with these topics. So one more chance, otherwise Yes, tell me. So real-world data plays a large role in evidence synthesis and purpose approval activities to resolve around real-world data and real-world evidence, and in conditions requiring emergency approvals like COVID, it even plays a larger role as expected, yeah. But as well, it can differ a lot and it constantly changes. How do regulatory bodies ensure timely approval free from the variations? That's a great point. And I think to your point on how we have seen this in COVID-19, all of the aspects that I've mentioned before have been really catalyzed somehow by the COVID-19 pandemic. We have seen how we really need to use technology in trials to ensure trials can continue. We have seen how we need to use remote monitoring tools to monitor patients at home because they could not come to the clinic. We have seen how real-world evidence has been used for also, as you say, either the vaccines or for the therapeutics to inform further the approvals, or even, so really all of these new technologies, the COVID pandemic has shown how much we need them and how much potential they have. Clinical trial industry has not been great in using technologies before, and now we see the potential, like with the centralized trials. Your question is very valid on this data can really fluctuate, change. Can we actually rely on it as much as we can rely on clinical trial data? And I would say that that's a bias and an aspect that we need to consider here. There are a lot of work going on real world data quality. There's work going on in industry associations like Transcelerate, and also work going on with the agencies and discussions to ensure that we evaluate what's the quality of the data. We improve that data as much as we can. We cannot make it up to clinical trial quality for sure, but at least we understand what are the biases that may be in the data, what are the weaknesses. And that would help even better understand how you can use that specific data for regulatory decision making. And when we think about real world data, it's a lot of different data sources that can be used, right? Electronic health records, registries, data collected by digital tools, and each of them are going to have their own specific pitfalls and their own specific opportunities. So I think we cannot generalize. We need to look at it from each data source perspective, and then we need to look at that variability in the data and whether more data means better results and more strong results at the end that you can really rely on, or whether it's more variability and less strong results. So I think your question is really valid, and we need to look at it from each data source perspective on what is bringing to us. I agree with you. Let's hope that they that regulatory agencies adopt the new technologies and what we have learned. So there are big discussions, and also regulatory agencies are really prone to continuing with the flexibilities they included in the pandemic. So we see that in different guidances. We see for clinical trials, for example, we had specific guidances with flexibilities during the pandemic, and we're seeing agencies. One example is Europe. The Danish agency has now released a guidance on decentralized trials, stating there, because we want to continue with the flexibilities that made sense during the COVID pandemic, this is how we're thinking about it and to implement it in the future. And when I'm discussing with colleagues from my past experience at regulatory agencies, they're also really looking for, okay, what have we learned from the pandemic? They're working very closely with sponsors. What have been your learnings on the data? What have been your learnings in the implementation of some of these new technologies, like digital measures, telemedicine, mobile nursing, and what has been the impact on the data? Have we actually seen an impact on the data, including more bias? And how can we ensure that in the future we continue with these flexibilities? One aspect that is interesting, for example, with the seamless designs that we have seen for some of these treatments or vaccines, where you had phase 1, 2, and 3 in the same protocol. If you had done that some years ago, there was much less openness from regulators to accept that. But because we were in this exceptional circumstances, it was accepted. And now we have seen how it actually has brought very good data sets that were valid for approval of these vaccines or treatments. So I think they're really now starting to see the potential of this and really engaging in discussions, and hopefully that will stay. So thanks for that comment. I'm glad that you learned some new things as well. And thank you for that. So, for example, with this comment on regulatory measures in medical device development, yes, you will now get a feedback form where one of the questions is what other topics you would like to see, and we can certainly make that happen. So I just covered very little on medical device development, but that's really a very exciting field as well, where we can certainly bring very knowledgeable speakers to our webinar series to talk about those aspects, what measures can be used, how medical device development is different from drug development as well, the different mindsets that exist in these two words. And I know as well in India, there has been a new medical device legislation coming into place. So even we could go into analyzing how that has played out. So please write the topics that you're interested in. We're looking forward to bringing more of these webinars to you and also bringing the topics that are interesting for you. So stay tuned for more information on the next webinar on regulatory policy. And if there are no more questions,
Please fill in
I wish
the
you
feedback.
all safe continuity. I hope you're all safe and healthy, and I look forward to seeing you in the next 1 or 2 months for the next webinar. All the best to you all. Bye.
Thank you.
Please fill in your feedbacks. I've shared the link in the chat box.